Right now, something strange is happening, and you almost certainly aren't noticing it. You're seeing these words. There's a voice in your head reading them. There's the faint awareness of your body in the chair or on the bed or wherever you are. Maybe a sound somewhere in the background. Maybe the temperature of the room. All of these things are appearing to you at once, in a kind of unified field, and there is someone, apparently, having all of them. Now try this. Try to find the having. Not the things being had. The words, the voice, the body, the room. The having of them. The fact that any of this is being experienced at all, instead of just happening in the dark. If you actually try, you'll notice you can't quite locate it. You can describe everything that's appearing in your awareness. You cannot describe the awareness itself. You can only do it. That, in its sharpest form, is the deepest unsolved problem in modern science. Not how the brain works. We've made enormous progress on that. The problem is why the brain working produces any of this. Why there is something it is like to be you sitting there right now, instead of just biology happening with no one home. Every contemplative tradition on Earth has been pointing at this question for over 2,000 years. Modern science has only seriously taken it on for about 50. The two are now starting to meet in the middle. And what they're finding is genuinely strange. Start with what science has done well. Because science has done a lot. Over the past century, neuroscience has mapped the brain in extraordinary detail. We know which regions process vision, which regions process language, which regions handle memory, emotion, motor control, fear, recognition, planning. We can put a person in a scanner, show them a photograph, and tell you with reasonable accuracy what kind of object they're looking at by reading the patterns of activity in their visual cortex. In the 1990s, two researchers, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, and Christof Koch, then at Caltech, set out to find what they called the neural correlates of consciousness. Not consciousness-y itself, just the specific brain activity that reliably accompanies it. The minimum machinery the brain needs to be running for the lights to be on. This program has been remarkably successful. We now know that certain kinds of activity in the cerebral cortex are tightly correlated with conscious experience. We know that some regions, like the cerebellum, can be entirely removed without anyone losing the lights. We know that under anesthesia, the integration of activity across the brain breaks down in measurable ways. We know which brain states correspond to dreaming, to deep sleep, to coma, to being awake. In 1994, the philosopher David Chalmers went to a conference in Tucson, Arizona, and gave a talk that changed how the field talks about itself. Chalmers said this: "All of the work science is doing on consciousness, on attention, on memory, on perception, on the difference between sleeping and waking, all of it is real progress." He called these the easy problems. Not because they're easy, they're enormously difficult. He called them easy because we know, in principle, how to solve them. We can keep mapping. We can keep correlating. Eventually, given enough time, we will have a complete account of what the brain does. But, Chalmers said, there is one more problem, and it is qualitatively different from all the others. Why does any of this brain activity feel like anything? Why isn't it all just happening in the dark? Why is there an inside? This he called the hard problem. Notice what makes it hard. It is not that we lack data. It is that the kind of explanation science gives, describing physical processes and their relationships, does not seem to be the kind of explanation that could ever account for why physical processes produce experience. You can describe everything a neuron does, everything a network of neurons does, everything a brain does. And at the end of the description, the question is still standing there. Yes, but why does any of it feel like something? The American philosopher Thomas Nagel had pointed at this same problem in 1974 in an essay called "What is it like to be a bat?" Nagel's point was simple. We can study a bat's brain. We can map every neuron. We can describe its echolocation in complete physical detail. And we will still not know what it is like from the inside to be a bat hunting at dusk. The inside is not the kind of thing that shows up in the description. Chalmers gave it the name that stuck: the hard problem. 30 years later, it is still hard. Researchers disagree about what would even count as a solution. Now, here's the strange part. While Western science has been hitting this wall for the last few decades, several ancient contemplative traditions have spent thousands of years operating as if the wall isn't there. Not because they solved it, because they started somewhere completely different. Take Advaita Vedanta. This is one of the oldest schools of Indian philosophy, and its most famous expositor is a thinker named Adi Shankara, who lived in southern India in the 8th century AD. Shankara made an argument that no Western scientist would have made, and that Western philosophy is only now starting to take seriously. Shankara said this: consciousness is not a problem to be explained. Consciousness is the only thing that doesn't need explaining, because it's the only thing you have direct access to. You can doubt the existence of the world. You can doubt the existence of your body. You can doubt the existence of other minds. The one thing you cannot doubt is that something is aware right now, because doubting itself is awareness. Consciousness, Shankara said, is the bedrock. Everything else is what shows up inside it. So when modern science asks how the brain produces consciousness, Shankara would say the question is upside down. The brain doesn't produce consciousness. The brain appears inside consciousness, like the room you're sitting in, like the words on this screen. A few centuries earlier, in roughly the 4th century AD, a Buddhist school called Yogacara was making a similar argument with different vocabulary. The Yogacara philosophers, particularly two brothers named Asanga and Vasubandhu, argued that what we take to be a world of independent objects is, on closer examination, a field of experience. Trees, walls, other people, sounds, thoughts, all of them, when you look carefully, show up as appearances within awareness. We assume there is a world out there causing the appearances. The Yogacara philosophers asked with some force what evidence we actually have for that assumption beyond the appearances themselves. 1,000 years later, in 12th century Andalusia, a Sufi philosopher named Ibn Arabi reached a similar place from a third direction. Ibn Arabi argued that all of existence is a single divine substance, and that consciousness, what he called the breath of the compassionate, is what that substance fundamentally is. The world is not made of matter that occasionally produces minds. The world is made of awareness that occasionally takes the shape of objects. 3 traditions, 3 vocabularies, 3 different cultural contexts, and essentially the same claim. Consciousness is not a side effect of matter. Consciousness is the fundamental thing. For most of the last few centuries of Western philosophy, this claim would have been dismissed out of hand. It sounded mystical. It sounded prescientific. The whole thrust of modern thought, since Descartes, has been the opposite. The world is made of matter, and consciousness is somehow produced by certain arrangements of that matter, and our job is to figure out how. But in the last 20 years, something has shifted. If you've made it this far, this is exactly the kind of question this channel keeps coming back to. Hit subscribe. There's more on the way. Here's what shifted. A small but growing number of serious philosophers and scientists working entirely within the Western analytic tradition have started to argue that the hard problem might be hard for a specific reason, namely, that consciousness is not the kind of thing matter produces, because consciousness is, in some form, a basic feature of reality itself. The position is called Panpsychism. It is no longer a fringe view. The British philosopher Galen Strawson made the case for it in a widely discussed 2006 paper. Philip Goff at Durham University has argued for it across multiple books in the last decade. The Dutch philosopher Bernardo Kastrup goes further, arguing for full idealism, the position that physical reality is itself something appearing within consciousness, much like Shankara argued in the 8th century. These are not religious thinkers borrowing from religion. They are analytic philosophers working with arguments and counter-arguments, who have arrived at conclusions remarkably close to what the contemplative traditions have been saying for over 1,000 years. Most neuroscientists still don't accept this. Christof Koch himself has moved toward a version of panpsychism over the years, but most of his colleagues haven't. The mainstream view remains that consciousness is something the brain does, somehow, and that we will eventually figure out how. The hard problem, on this view, is hard but not unsolvable. Just unsolved. So here's where the two approaches stand. Science approaches consciousness from the outside. It studies brains. It correlates activity. It builds models. It is enormously good at this and has hit a wall it cannot so far climb over. The wall is the inside. The contemplative traditions approach consciousness from the inside. They study awareness directly by becoming very still and looking. They claim that what they find, when they look carefully enough, is that consciousness is not a private possession of an individual brain. It is something more like a field in which individuals appear and into which they dissolve at death. These two approaches generate radically different predictions about what we should expect to find. If the scientific picture is right, consciousness should require a brain. When the brain stops, consciousness stops. There is nothing to leave the body, because there was never anything separable in the first place. If the contemplative picture is right, the brain might be more like a receiver than a generator, something that filters and shapes a wider awareness rather than producing one, which would mean that what happens to consciousness when the brain stops is not as obvious as modern science assumes. We currently have no agreed way to decide between these two pictures. The data underdetermines the answer. People have looked at the same brain scans, the same near-death experience reports, the same meditation studies, and walked away with completely different stories about what they imply. What we can say is this: the hard problem is real. It has not been solved. It has not even been clearly defined in a way everyone agrees on. The traditions had a head start of about 2,000 years, and what they've been saying turns out to overlap in surprising places with what some of the most rigorous Western philosophers are now starting to argue. Whether that overlap means they were right, or whether it means human beings keep producing similar stories when they push the question past where evidence can take them, is itself a question we cannot currently answer. What is consciousness? Nobody knows. And the longer the question is studied seriously, the stranger the answer seems likely to be. So here's the question for you. Do you think consciousness is something the brain produces or something the brain is made out of? And when you actually try to find the answer, do you trust looking outward through science more? Or looking inward through contemplation? Because the answer to the second question may decide the answer to the first. Leave a comment. The conversation is the point.